Imagine laughing so hard you can't stop for days until you're in pain and can't go to school, and then it spreads to hundreds of others, closing down 14 schools. Or picture a city terrified by a hairy, ape-like creature that reportedly scratched and bit people, leading to real injuries and even deaths as panicked citizens tried to flee. And what if dozens of factory workers suddenly felt sharp pains like insect bites, forcing the entire plant to shut down, even though exhaustive searches found no bugs capable of causing such reactions? These aren't scenes from movies. They are real events that left communities bewildered and scientists searching for answers that in many ways still haven't fully come. Number 11. The Tanzanian Laughing Epidemic that shut down a countryside. It all began quite innocently on January 30th, 1962, at a mission-run boarding school for girls in Kashasha, a small village in what was then Tanganyika, now Taksak. 3 students started laughing. This wasn't ordinary laughter. It was uncontrollable, lasting for hours, sometimes days. It was often accompanied by crying, restlessness, and even pain. The affected girls couldn't concentrate on their studies. Within a few weeks, 95 of the school's 159 pupils, mostly aged between 12 and 18, were afflicted. The school was forced to close its doors in mid-March. Sending the students home didn't stop. Instead, the phenomenon spread. When the Kashasha girls returned to their home villages, others started to exhibit the same symptoms. One of the most affected areas was Mumba, home to several of the girls. There, by May, over 200 people, mostly young people but also some adults, were caught in these fits of laughing and crying. The epidemic rippled outwards, reaching other villages and schools. In total, it's estimated that over 1,000 people were affected, and as many as 14 schools were temporarily shut down, disrupting the lives of thousands more. The symptoms would come in waves, sometimes subsiding for a bit, only to return. The entire ordeal lasted for an astonishing period, with some reports suggesting it lingered in different communities for 6 months, while others claim sporadic outbreaks continued for up to 18 months. Local authorities and medical personnel were baffled. They conducted investigations taking blood samples from those affected and examining the local environment for any clues. They searched for toxins in food and water, looked for signs of infectious disease, but found nothing. There was no identifiable virus, no bacteria, no poison that could explain the bizarre and widespread symptoms. Theories emerged, with some modern researchers suggesting it was a case of mass psychogenic illness or mass hysteria, possibly triggered by the stresses of a newly independent nation and the strict expectations at the mission schools. However, the sheer duration, the geographical spread, and the specific, debilitating nature of the symptoms far beyond simple giggling make it a profoundly strange chapter in medical history. Why did it take this particular form? What was the precise trigger that set off such an extraordinary chain reaction across an entire region? Science offers labels, but the full story of the Tanzanian laughter remains deeply perplexing. Number 10. The dancing plague of 1518 that made people dance themselves to death. In the summer of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, a woman known as Frau Trophea stepped into the street and began to dance. There was no music, just an unstoppable urge that kept her feet moving. She danced for days, without rest. Within a week, about 36 other people had joined her, their bodies seemingly taken over by the same frenzied, compulsive movement. And it didn't stop there. By August, the number of dancers had swelled to an astonishing 400 citizens. The city authorities were alarmed. At first, they consulted local physicians who, attributing the phenomenon to hot blood, bizarrely prescribed more dancing. They even cleared a guild hall and set up a wooden stage, hiring musicians to play and professional dancers to join in, believing that the afflicted would dance the illness out of their systems. This, however, seemed only to encourage more people to join the uncontrollable dance. The dancers jigged and twirled relentlessly, day and night. Many suffered from exhaustion, dehydration, and injuries. Historical accounts state that some people literally danced themselves to death, succumbing to strokes, heart attacks, or sheer physical collapse. At its peak, it was said that up to 15 people were dying each day. Desperate, the city council changed tack. They banned public dancing and music. The remaining dancers were rounded up and taken to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus, a saint believed to have powers over nervous disorders, including what was then sometimes called Saint Vitus's dance. Various theories have been proposed over the centuries to explain this extraordinary event. One popular theory is ergotism, poisoning from a fungus called ergot that can grow on rye bread. Ergot contains psychoactive chemicals that can cause convulsions, hallucinations, and tremors. However, some historians argue that the coordinated, if frantic, dancing isn't typical of ergot-induced spasms, which are usually more random and debilitating. Another theory points to extreme psychological distress. The region had been suffering from famine, poverty, and widespread diseases like smallpox and syphilis. It suggested that the dancing was a form of mass stress-induced hysteria, perhaps linked to religious beliefs about divine punishment or possession. Yet, no single explanation fully accounts for the intensity, the duration, and the deadly outcome of the Strasbourg dancing plague. The sight of hundreds of people compelled to dance until they collapsed or died remains one of history's most unsettling and not fully understood mass events. Number 9. The mysterious twitching outbreak that hit a New York town. In late 2011, something strange started happening in the small town of Leroy, New York. A handful of teenage girls, students at Leroy Junior-Senior High School, began developing alarming symptoms. It started with 1 or 2, then spread. They experienced uncontrollable tics, muscle twitches, stuttering, verbal outbursts, and even seizure-like episodes. By early 2012, the number of affected individuals had grown to around 18 students, predominantly girls, and 1 adult woman in her late 30s. The symptoms were strikingly similar to Tourette's syndrome, but their sudden onset in a cluster was highly unusual. The community was understandably frightened, and parents demanded answers. Media attention soon followed, turning a local medical mystery into a national story. Doctors and environmental investigators launched a comprehensive inquiry. They conducted numerous medical tests on the affected teens, including brain scans, blood tests, and neurological exams. They also investigated the school and surrounding environment for potential toxins. Leroy is near a site of a 1970 chemical spill, and there were concerns about natural gas drilling, fracking, in the region, but extensive environmental testing found no specific contaminants linked to the symptoms. One early theory explored was PANDAS, pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorders associated with streptococcal infections, which suggests that a strep infection can trigger an autoimmune response that affects the brain. Some of the girls did test positive for strep or had a history of. However, this diagnosis didn't fit all the cases, and it remained a point of contention. Eventually, many medical professionals, including neurologist Dr. Laszlo Mettler, who treated many of the girls, concluded that the most likely explanation was conversion disorder, a type of mass psychogenic illness where psychological stress manifests as physical symptom. The intense media scrutiny and social media speculation were thought to have potentially exacerbated the situation. However, not everyone was satisfied with this diagnosis. Some families and even some medical experts like environmental activist Aaron Brockovich, who got involved, continued to question whether an environmental trigger had been overlooked. Precise cause of the initial symptoms and the mechanism by which they spread through the specific group remain subjects of debate for some. While the label conversion disorder offers a framework, the visual and distressing nature of the tics and the community's search for a tangible cause left lingering unease and questions about how and why the specific outbreak occurred in this particular place. Number 8. The day hundreds of kids just collapsed at an English summer show. Sunday, July 13th, 1980, was meant to be a fun day out at the Hollinwell Show, an annual event held at the Ladywood School grounds in Hollinwell, near Kirkby, in Ashfield, Nottinghamshire, England. Hundreds of children, many of them participants in a junior brass and marching band competition, were present. Suddenly, during the show, children started to feel unwell. They complained of burning throats, dizziness, nausea, and then began fainting. One after another, children collapsed to the ground. Panic quickly spread among the attendees and organizers. Emergency services were called, and a major incident was declared. In total, around 300 people, mostly children but also some adults, reported symptoms. Ambulances ferried many of them to local hospitals. Eyewitness accounts described chaotic scenes, with children lying on the grass, some vomiting, others simply unconscious. Doctors and nurses at the hospitals were faced with a sudden influx of patients, exhibiting similar, puzzling symptoms, but with no immediately obvious cause. A thorough investigation was launched. Authorities initially suspected some form of poisoning. They looked into food and drink sold at the event, but found no common source. They tested the water supply, but it was clear. Attention then turned to environmental factors. One prominent theory was pesticide poisoning, as a nearby field had reportedly been sprayed with a pesticide called tridamorph earlier in the week. However, tests for pesticide levels in blood and urine samples from the affected children were largely inconclusive or did not show levels considered high enough to cause such widespread illness. Other theories floated included radio waves from a nearby transmitter, or even more fancifully unusual atmospheric conditions. No definitive evidence was found to support any of these. In the end, many investigators leaned towards a diagnosis of mass hysteria, possibly triggered by an initial few children feeling unwell due to heat, excitement, or a mild, unidentified irritant. Some children reported a funny smell, but this was never substantiated. The sight of others fainting could have then triggered a cascade effect in the emotionally charged atmosphere of a large public event. However, the sheer number of people affected the consistency of some of the initial symptoms like sore eyes and throats reported by some, and the failure to pinpoint a definitive trigger has left the Hollinwell incident as a particularly striking and unsettling example of mass illness. For the families involved and the community at large, the day hundreds of children inexplicably collapsed remains a disturbing memory, with the why never fully concretely answered to everyone's satisfaction. Number 7. The West Bank fainting sickness that sparked an international incident. In late March 1983, a wave of mysterious illnesses swept through Palestinian schools in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. It began in the town of Araba, where a schoolgirl complained of a strange odor, followed by symptoms of dizziness, nausea, blurred vision, headaches, abdominal pain, and fainting. Soon, dozens of her classmates were experiencing similar symptoms. The phenomenon didn't stay confined to Araba. Over the following days and weeks, similar outbreaks were reported in other schools in nearby towns, like Jenin and even Hebron, eventually affecting hundreds of people. The numbers were startling. Over 900 individuals, predominantly young Palestinian schoolgirls, but also some Palestinian women, and even a few Israeli soldiers stationed in the area, sought medical treatment for these symptoms. The situation quickly escalated beyond a local health crisis, becoming a major political flashpoint. Palestinian leaders and media accused Israeli settlers or the military of deliberately using some form of poison gas to harm the students. These accusations fueled widespread fear and anger in the Palestinian community and drew international attention. Israeli authorities denied any use of poison and launched their own investigation. International bodies, including the International Red Cross and the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, also became involved, sending teams to investigate the puzzling outbreaks. Extensive medical examinations were conducted on the affected individuals. Blood, urine, and water samples were analyzed. Environmental tests were carried out in the affected schools and surrounding areas, searching for any traces of toxic gases or other chemical agents. Despite the exhaustive searches, investigators found no consistent evidence of any specific poison or environmental toxin that could account for the widespread symptoms. While some initial reports mentioned finding traces of hydrogen, sulfide, or other irritants in certain locations, these findings were not consistent across all affected areas, nor were they at levels typically associated with such severe or widespread reactions. The official conclusions from the Israeli health authorities and the CDC pointed towards mass psychogenic illness, or mass hysteria. They suggested that the symptoms were real but were likely triggered and spread by psychological factors such as anxiety and stress in the highly tense and politically charged atmosphere of the occupied territories. It was proposed that perhaps an initial environmental irritant, like a bad smell from a poorly maintained latrine or a low-level non-lethal substance, might have affected a few individuals, and then fear and rumor amplified by the political situation caused the symptoms to spread rapidly through suggestion. However, for many Palestinians, this explanation was unsatisfactory, and suspicions of deliberate poisoning linger. The lack of a definitively identified initial physical trigger for the very first cases and the sheer scale of the phenomenon means that while mass hysteria is the widely accepted scientific explanation, the 1983 West Bank fainting epidemic remains a complex and sensitive case, highlighting how social and political anxieties can intertwine with health in profound ways. Number 6. The phantom anesthetist who terrorized an Illinois town. The summer of 1944 was a period of heightened anxiety in the United States due to World War II. In the small city of Mattoon, Illinois, this anxiety took a very peculiar and terrifying turn. It began on the night of August 31st, when a man named Urban Rafe reported a strange, sweet odor in his home, followed by his wife experiencing a brief paralysis of her legs and difficulty breathing. The next night, a similar incident occurred at the home of Bert Kearney. He and his wife awoke to a strong, sweet smell. Mrs. Kearney reported feeling her legs and lower body paralyzed, and she was unable to scream for help. Her husband, though also affected by the gas, managed to raise an alarm. Over the next 2 weeks, the mad gasser of Mattoon, also dubbed the phantom anesthetist, became a local terror. More than a dozen similar incidents were reported. Pattern was often the same: a sickly sweet odor, sometimes described as like cheap perfume or flower-scented, would seep into a house, usually through an open window. Occupants would then experience symptoms such as nausea, vomiting, palpitations, dryness of the mouth, and a temporary paralysis of the limbs. Some victims claimed to have seen a shadowy figure lurking outside their windows or heard someone trying to force entry. Panic gripped Mattoon. Residents armed themselves, formed vigilante groups, and boarded up their windows despite the summer heat. The local police force was overwhelmed, and eventually the FBI was called in to assist. Despite intensive investigations, no physical evidence of any anesthetic gas was ever found. No gassing apparatus was discovered. No suspect was ever apprehended. Police did find some unusual footprints outside some of the homes and a piece of cloth near one window, but these led nowhere. Skepticism grew among investigators. They noted inconsistencies in some of the testimonies and the fact that many attacks occurred after the story had gained widespread publicity, suggesting that fear and suggestion might be playing a significant role. The Illinois State Police criminologist who investigated suggested that some initial incidents might have been real, perhaps caused by industrial pollutants from nearby factories. One plant used carbon tetrachloride, though its odor and effects weren't a perfect match, and that subsequent reports were a product of mass hysteria, fueled by wartime nerves and sensationalized media coverage. The attacks ceased as suddenly as they had begun around mid-September. True identity and motive of the mad gasser, if one ever existed, remain unknown. Was it a lone deviant with a strange chemical weapon? Was it pollution misinterpreted in a climate of fear? Or was it primarily a case of collective delusion, where anxiety manifested in shared physical symptoms and the belief in a phantom attacker? The Mattoon Gasser incident is still debated by sociologists and historians. A chilling example of how fear can take on a life of its own, creating a very real terror from an unseen and perhaps non-existent threat. Science could not find the gasser, nor could it definitively explain away every reported detail. Number 5. The Blackburn fainting fits that emptied a school. On a Thursday morning in early October 1965, a strange series of events unfolded at a girls' secondary school in Blackburn, Lancashire, England. It began somewhat undramatically. A few girls reportedly felt faint during a morning assembly or church service. However, what happened next was anything but ordinary. Over the course of about 2 hours, an epidemic of fainting and other distressing symptoms swept through the school. Girl after girl started to complain of dizziness. Many fainted outright. Others were observed moaning, chattering their teeth, and exhibiting signs of hyperventilation, overbreathing. The situation escalated rapidly, with staff struggling to cope with the sheer number of affected students. Ambulances were called, and soon a stream of them began ferrying the ill girls to a local hospital. In total, 85 girls from the school were taken to the hospital, all reporting a similar cluster of symptoms. The school was eventually forced to close for the day to deal with the crisis and prevent further spread. Medical authorities launched an immediate and thorough investigation. They meticulously examined the affected girls' running tests to identify any common illness or exposure. Simultaneously, public health officials inspected the school premises. They checked for gas, leaks from heating systems or science labs, looked for any signs of food poisoning from the canteen, and tested the air and water for contaminants. Despite these extensive efforts, no physical cause could be found. All the tests on the girls came back normal, and the school environment was deemed safe. There was no identifiable pathogen, no toxin, no environmental factor that could explain why so many girls had suddenly fallen ill in such a dramatic fashion. Conclusion reached by medical experts at the time was that the incident was a case of mass hysteria, or what today might be termed mass psychogenic illness. They theorized that the outbreak might have been triggered by a combination of factors. Some reports suggested the girls had attended a rather long and perhaps emotionally taxing parade or public event earlier in the week. Additionally, there was an ongoing polio epidemic in the country at the time, which may have created a background level of heightened anxiety about health and illness among the students and the wider community. It was thought that an initial, perhaps coincidental fainting spell by one or two girls could have acted as a trigger, with anxiety and suggestion causing the symptoms to spread rapidly among the susceptible group of adolescent girls in the enclosed school environment. While this explanation provides a framework, the sheer speed and scale of the Blackburn fainting fits and the very real distress experienced by the girls serve as a stark reminder of the powerful connection between mind and body, and how collective emotions can manifest in startling physical ways, sometimes without a clearly identifiable external spark. Number 4. The Halifax slasher panic that never drew blood, almost. In November 1938, the industrial town of Halifax in West Yorkshire, England, was gripped by a terrifying fear. It began when two women, Gertrude Hilarious and Mary Gledhill, reported being attacked by a mysterious man. They claimed he had wielded a mallet and wore shoes with bright buckles. Their story, frightening enough on its own, quickly ignited a wave of panic throughout the town. Soon, more reports of attacks began to surface, each adding to the growing legend of the Halifax slasher. Over the following weeks, dozens of people, predominantly women but also some men, came forward claiming they had been assaulted or threatened by this shadowy figure. The description of the attacker varied, but he was often said to be armed with a knife, a razor, or sharp implements attached to his hands. Victims typically reported that their coats or clothing had been slashed, or that they had received minor cuts or scratches. The fear became so intense that local businesses were affected. Some mills closed early to allow workers, especially women, to get home before dark. Vigilante groups formed, with men patrolling the streets armed with makeshift weapons, determined to catch the slasher. The atmosphere in Halifax was one of extreme tension and fear. The local police were inundated with reports and struggled to make sense of the situation. Eventually, detectives from Scotland Yard were called in to assist with the investigation. As they delved deeper, a pattern began to emerge. Many of the reported attacks lacked credible evidence. Some victims had injuries that appeared to be self-inflicted or accidental. In several cases, individuals later admitted to fabricating their stories, perhaps out of a desire for attention or to conform to the prevailing panic. One man, Percy Waddington, publicly confessed that his report of being attacked was a lie, made up to claim a reward that had been offered, or simply to be part of the unfolding drama. His confession, along with the increasing skepticism from the police, helped to puncture the bubble of fear. Slowly, the panic began to subside. While it's possible that a few genuine minor assaults may have occurred at the outset, sparking the initial fear, the vast majority of the slasher incidents were deemed by investigators to be the product of mass hysteria and rumor. The Halifax slasher, as a widespread menace terrorizing the town, likely never existed in the way the public imagined. Case is a classic example of collective delusion. It wasn't that science couldn't find the slasher after an extensive hunt. It was that the slasher was largely a phantom, conjured from widespread anxiety, rumor, and the power of suggestion. The intensity of the collective belief, which led to significant social disruption and genuine terror based on very little concrete evidence, remains a fascinating and cautionary tale about the psychology of crowds. Number 3. The June bug epidemic that bit an entire factory. In June 1962, an unusual outbreak occurred in a dressmaking factory located in a southern town in the United States. The exact location and company name were often kept vague in reports to protect the business. It started when a few workers suddenly began to complain of being bitten by insects they couldn't see. They reported feeling sharp pains followed by the appearance of rashes and experienced symptoms such as nausea, dizziness, and numbness. The belief that there were bugs in a recent shipment of fabric spread like wildfire through the factory floor. Within a matter of days, the situation escalated dramatically. The number of affected workers swelled to over 60. They described being attacked by these invisible June bugs, a name that stuck, even though no actual June bugs were ever implicated. The symptoms were consistent: a sensation of being bitten, followed by skin irritation and sometimes more systemic effects like feeling generally unwell. Panic set in among the workforce. The fear of these mysterious biting bugs became so pervasive that the factory management was forced to temporarily shut down operations and call in public health officials and entomologists to investigate. The investigators conducted a thorough search of the entire factory. They meticulously examined the premises, the machinery, and especially the shipment of fabric that was being blamed for the outbreak. They did find a few common insects, such as mites, gnats, and ants, but none of these were present in sufficient numbers to cause such a widespread problem, nor were they species known to cause the specific type of acute reactions reported by so many workers. Crucially, no insects capable of inflicting the bites and causing the described symptoms were found in the fabric shipment or anywhere else in the plant. The factory was fumigated as a precaution, but the mystery remained. What had caused so many people to experience such vivid physical symptoms? Public health officials eventually concluded that the June bug epidemic was a case of hysterical contagion, or mass psychogenic illness. They suggested that factors such as stress from working conditions, perhaps long hours or production pressures, the hot summer weather, and the power of suggestion in a relatively closed and close-knit environment likely contributed to the outbreak. An initial, perhaps coincidental itch or skin irritation experienced by one or two workers might have been misinterpreted as an insect bite. Once this idea took hold, especially if linked to a contaminated fabric shipment, anxiety could have caused others to become hyper-aware of normal skin sensations, misinterpreting them as bites, and genuinely experiencing the associated distress. While the workers' symptoms were real to them, the cause was determined to be psychological rather than entomological. The incident remains a classic case study in how collective anxiety can manifest as shared physical symptoms, even creating the strong sensation of being bitten by non-existent creatures. Number 2. The Monkey Man of Delhi who leapt out of nightmares. In the sweltering heat of May 2001, a wave of terror swept through the sprawling city of Delhi, India. It began with scattered reports of a strange ape-like creature attacking people primarily in the densely populated, poorer eastern and northern neighborhoods of the city. This entity quickly acquired a name: the Kala Bandar, Black Monkey, or simply the Monkey Man. Descriptions varied, but it was often said to be about 4 to 5 feet tall, hairy, with a monkey-like face, sometimes with glowing red eyes, metallic claws, or even a helmet. It was reported to leap from rooftop to rooftop with incredible agility, appearing suddenly at night to scratch, bite, or push its victims. The number of reported sightings and attacks quickly multiplied. Dozens, and eventually perhaps over 100 people claimed to have been assaulted by the Monkey Man. The injuries reported included scratches, bruises, and bite marks. Panic was palpable. People were terrified to sleep on their rooftops, a common practice during the hot Delhi summers. Vigilante groups formed, armed with sticks and other makeshift weapons, patrolling their neighborhoods in an attempt to protect their families and catch the creature. Police were inundated with calls and struggled to manage the escalating fear and maintain order. They even offered a substantial financial reward for any information leading to the capture of the Monkey Man. Tragically, the panic had deadly consequences. At least 2 or 3 people died, not directly from attacks by the creature, but as a result of the surrounding chaos. One pregnant woman fell down a flight of stairs while fleeing in terror after neighbors shouted that the Monkey Man was nearby. Another man jumped from a building, believing the creature was after him. There were also instances of mob violence where innocent individuals were mistaken for the monkey man and attacked by panicked crowds. Despite the numerous eyewitness accounts and the very real fear, no such creature was ever caught. No clear photographs or definitive physical evidence of its existence ever emerged. Police investigated various leads, including the possibility of an escaped animal from a zoo or a prankster using a costume, but nothing concrete was found. Some fur samples reportedly collected from attack sites turned out to be from common animals. Many officials and sociologists began to suspect that the monkey man phenomenon was a case of mass hysteria. They pointed to factors such as widespread power outages in the affected areas, making it easier to imagine figures in the dark, the oppressive summer heat, existing superstitions, and the rapid spread of rumors in crowded urban environments. It was suggested that perhaps a few initial unexplained incidents or even animal encounters were magnified and distorted by fear and rumor, leading to a collective belief in a monstrous attacker. While some genuine injuries did occur, whether from misidentified animals self-inflicted in panic or from other humans, the monkey man as a singular supernatural entity remained elusive. The mystery of what, if anything, truly sparked the initial reports and fueled such intense, widespread terror was never fully resolved, leaving the monkey man of Delhi as a chilling legend of modern urban folklore. Number 1. The Welsh High Hex that sickened a school. In the autumn of 1962, specifically around October and November, a perplexing affliction began to spread among the students of Welsh High School in the small town of Welsh, Louisiana. It started with a few students, primarily girls, who began complaining of a disturbing array of symptoms. They reported feeling dizzy, suffering from headaches, experiencing nausea, and a strange numbness or tingling in their arms and legs. Some students hyperventilated, others fainted, and a few even described temporary periods of paralysis or weakness in their limbs. As days turned into weeks, the number of affected students grew steadily. The symptoms seemed to ripple through the student body, creating an atmosphere of anxiety and confusion within the school and the wider community. Rumors began to circulate rapidly. Some whispered that a hex or a curse had been placed upon the school or certain students, a notion that gained traction in the close-knit, somewhat rural community. Others feared that a new, unidentified infectious disease was sweeping through the classrooms. The situation became so disruptive, with dozens of students falling ill, that school authorities were forced to take drastic measures, including temporarily closing the school on more than one occasion to try and stem the tide of the mysterious illness. Local physicians and public health officials were deeply concerned and launched a comprehensive investigation. They conducted thorough medical examinations on the students who reported symptoms, including blood tests and in some cases spinal taps, to rule out known infections or neurological disorders. The school environment itself was meticulously inspected. Investigators looked for any potential toxins in the air or water, checked for issues with sanitation or food handling, and searched for any other environmental contaminants that might explain the outbreak. Despite these exhaustive efforts, all tests came back negative or inconclusive. No common physical illness could be identified, and no environmental hazard was found. The doctors were baffled. The symptoms were clearly real and causing significant distress, but there was no apparent physical cause. Prevailing explanation that emerged from the medical community was that the Welsh High Hex incident was a case of mass psychogenic illness, also known as epidemic hysteria. It was theorized that the initial symptoms in a few students, perhaps due to ordinary unrelated minor ailments or stress, were then amplified by anxiety and the power of suggestion within the susceptible adolescent population. The rumor of a hex likely fueled the anxiety, further creating a feedback loop where fear itself contributed to the spread of very real physical symptoms. However, the precise trigger that initiated this collective stress response was never definitively pinpointed. Was it general teenage anxieties, academic pressures, or did the hex rumor itself, once started, become the primary engine of the outbreak? The Welsh High School incident remains a significant case study in the annals of social psychology and epidemiology, demonstrating the profound capacity of the human mind, particularly in a group setting, to manifest psychological distress. The lack of a concrete pathogen or toxin, despite intense investigation, due to the mysterious and powerful nature of such collective behavioral phenomena.